Originally, when I sat down to make this video, I was just going to cover the color mix function in CSS. But as I dove deeper into the documentation, I realized that there's so much more to colors than just the color mix function. There's things like relative colors, color gamuts, built-in light and dark mode, a whole new color function, and so many other things that I knew I had to cover all of them, because as soon as I learned about these new features, I knew it was going to radically change how I wrote CSS colors going forward. So if I were you, I would recommend watching through this entire video, but if you want, I'll leave timestamps in the description so you can jump to the individual sections you care about. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle. My job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And before we can even dive into the really cool things like relative colors and color mixing, we first need to understand color spaces and color gamuts because those are going to be used in those other functions we're going to be talking about. So we're first going to start with color gamuts because that's a relatively easy thing to understand. And that's essentially how wide of a color range your browser can actually render out information. So this is going to depend on your browser as well as whatever monitor or laptop screen you're using to view this content. So if you have a monitor or laptop screen that has a high range of colors it can display, you have a larger color gamut. And the most common color gamuts that you're going to see inside of CSS, we have sRGB. This is like the most restrictive version of the color gamut, and it only allows you to view certain colors. Then we have display P3, which is a wider range, and then we finally have rec 2020. Now each of these ranges determines what level of colors you can render, and generally the wider a range you have, the more vibrant of colors you can render. A really easy way to see this is if we really quickly come in here and we add a media query, we have a media query called color gamut, and we can determine what color gamut we render to. So for example, I can see, do we support sRGB? So I can come in here and I can say, we'll just change our body to have a background of red. There we go. You can see my browser does support this because my background has changed to red. Now, if we wanted to check if we support P3, we could just type in P3 right here. That is like the next level of color range. And if I save, you'll notice my browser is no longer red. And that's because my monitor only supports this P3 color range if I have HDR enabled. Now, HDR is just kind of a fancy term for a higher dynamic range of colors. And if I do enable this, you'll probably immediately notice the video looks much darker and dimmer to you. That's because it's essentially, I don't record in HDR, so it's going to look really weird for you. But when I do refresh my browser, we'll notice the background color does change to red because now my browser supports that wider range of colors. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn HDR back off because it looks bad for recording. And now when I go ahead and refresh my page, I'll go back to that standard gamut of colors. So by enabling HDR in my monitor, I essentially enabled a wider range of colors for me to be able to view. Also, if I go to this site called wide-gamut.com, this is a site I'm going to leave linked in the description below. You can actually test your own monitor to see what all values it supports. And you can go to this take the test section, and this just allows you to look at a bunch of different things. For example, when I have HDR enabled, I can see a W inside this red square, but when I don't have it enabled, I can't see any W at all. And that's just saying that I don't have the ability to see this wider range of colors on my current monitor unless I enable HDR. So this is something inside of CSS we can determine, okay, does this person's browser enable us to view a larger range of colors? Because we can actually use that larger range of colors to actually display some really cool information to people. So for example, what we can do is normally when you define a color inside of CSS, it's going to use sRGB by default. That's essentially the lowest level of color range that we have, and pretty much every browser is going to support this. Now you may want to display a wider range of colors, especially to people that have support for example, a P3 monitor. So what we can do is we can actually define colors in these different color spaces by using the color function. It's literally just a function called color. And we can come in here and we can define what color space we want to use. Again, by default, colors are in the sRGB range. So if I wanted to define something in the sRGB range of 100, that's going to be pure red. And the way I define these colors is between 0 and 1, or I could do between 0 and 100% if I wanted as well. So here, this is red because I have 100% red, 0% green, 0% blue. And if I save, you can see I get a red background where I have that element showing up on my page, this box one that surrounds my other two boxes. Now, if I wanted to, I could use this in a different color space as well. Let's say that I want to do it in display P3. I'm going to give this a quick save. It's still going to show me a red color, but when I inspect my page and I go over to look at the color inside the DevTools, I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see. we'll click on our color right here, and you'll notice something really interesting. We get this line right here that divides my color space. So everything on the right-hand side, all these colors over here are only available in this wider color space, this P3 color space. While all these colors on the left-hand side, these are all available in the normal RGB color space that we're used to, while these colors over here are only available in that wider range of colors. So it allows me to actually view a slightly wider range of colors. And I can show you really quickly what that looks like by using a green color where we can show the same color in two different color spaces, and you'll be able to slightly be able to see the difference. So I'm going to use green here because green has about the widest range possible outside of the normal color space. I'm going to use 0.8 as my value. So we're going to have this value be in the sRGB. There we go. And then I'm going to copy that down here, and this one is going to be the display P3, just like that. So my internal boxes, these ones labeled box 2, are going to be using this wider range of colors, while this external box is going to be using a lower range of colors. Now if I save, you will hopefully be able to notice, it may not be possible with YouTube, but there are green boxes directly inside of this darker green area. Now I really quickly enabled HDR in my computer as well to hopefully be able to see this even easier. I don't know how well it'll show up on YouTube again, but these boxes are very noticeable on my computer to my eyes that they are a very different color from the outside green, and it's mostly just a much more vibrant greener color, while the other green is quite a bit duller looking. So if you want to use this wider color gamut, you have to use this color function, otherwise everything will default to that smaller sRGB color gamut. And again, you can use media queries to make sure a browser supports these colors before you actually use them. Otherwise, you want to make sure you use sRGB if the browser doesn't support these higher levels of P3 colors, because then what will end up happening is it has to essentially take this wider color range, shrink it down into a smaller color range, and you may not get the same colors across different browsers. So the whole point of this color function is to allow you to use a wider range of colors. The next thing I want to talk about is how you use relative colors. So converting from one color to another color directly inside of CSS without doing any complicated stuff. So what we can do is we can define any color that we want. I'm just going to define it inside of a CSS variable. We'll come up here and we'll just say color is going to be our color. And let's just say that we're going to use a normal RGB value. So we'll say RGB, we're going to say 255, 0, and 255, just like that. And then we can get this nice bright pink color that we're going to use everywhere else. And then what I want to do for my box 1, I don't even need this box 2 at all right now. We'll just kind of comment out the color on this so they essentially completely disappear. What we're going to do is we're going to change our color by getting a relative color. So we're going to say we want to get our own RGB color from an existing color, which in our case is going to be that variable that we defined. You don't have to use it a variable. I could hard code a color directly in here if I wanted to, but generally when you're using this in a real world project, you're going to use a variable. So what I'm doing, I'm saying I'm going to get my own RGB color from this existing color, and that's going to give me access to an R, a G, and a B variable. And those RGB variables are equal to the variables I used up here. So if I just type it in exactly like this, I say RGB from my existing color, and I type in RGB like that and I save, I'm going to get the exact same pink color, because essentially what it's doing is it's taking the red portion from this color, the green portion from this color, and the blue portion, and it's plugging them in right here. But I could change this if I want. You know what if I said, you know what, I don't want any red. I want to keep my green and blue exactly the same, but my red is going to be 0. If I give that a save, you can now see I get a blue color because it's taken my red value, set it to 0, my green value it got from here, which is 0, and my blue value it got from here, which is 255, which gives me a pure blue color. I can even mix and match different color spaces. For example, up here, I could define something in HSL. Let's just say we're going to do 200, 100%, and 50%. This is like a bright blue color. I'm going to use that as my color now, and I'm going to be getting just the green and, well, actually, let's just get the red and the blue portion from it. And if I give that a save, I'm going to get over here what the result of that is. If I get all the R, Gs, and Bs from it, I should get the exact same color I got up here. But let's say I get rid of all of the red content from it. Now I get whatever the color is over here, and so on. And I can even do other things. For example, I can do some calculations and say, you know what, I want to get my red value and I want to add a certain amount to it. So I can say, you know what, let's just add 10 to my red value. And let's actually make it a little bit larger. We'll say 100 so we can really see the difference. And you can see my color has changed quite a bit. We'll even change it to 200 so you can really see the difference. And now you can see it's added a ton of red into my particular color. This is really nice. We could even say, you know what, I want to take my blue, calculate that blue, and we'll just multiply that by 0.5 to reduce the amount of blue in my color. And now all of a sudden the amount of blue has been drastically reduced and I get this weirdish brown color. Another really nice thing about these relative colors is you can use any color function you want. You can use RGB. I can come in here with HSL, and that's going to give me the H, the S, and the L portions of my colors that I could use to create whatever color I want. I can even use it with the normal color function. I can specify what my color space and so on is going to be for this particular color. So I can really fine tune exactly how I want to go between different colors. The main reason you may want to use this, let's say I define my color using HSL. I'm going to come from my original HSL color, and all I want to do is to create a version for when I hover on something. So I can get my H and S the same as before, but I'm going to calculate my lightness, and maybe I'm just going to like add a little bit to it. So I'm going to say like add 0.1 to my lightness. Now if I give that a save, and I turn this into a hover effect, so I can say box1 hover, and I can specify that that is going to be the background. Otherwise my background is just going to be my normal color variable. So now when I hover over this, it's going to get a slightly brighter. Now technically you'll notice it's not actually working, and that's because lightness is a value between 0 and 100. So if I wanted to get 10% brighter, I would need to add 10 instead of 0.1. But now when I hover over this, you'll notice it gets 10% brighter. So this is a really easy way for me to add a hover effect into a particular element. I can just say, you know what, take this color, whatever it is, it doesn't even have to be defined in HSL. I can just say I'm converting it to HSL, I'm adding a slight amount of lightness to it. You could even modify the saturation and so on to really give you these fine-tuned hover effects on colors that are entirely dynamic that you haven't hard-coded at all. You can also really easily add opacity into an element as well. So let me just make this color exactly the same, HSL, but I'm going to make it 50% transparent. Now you'll notice this isn't quite working, and that's because when you're using the from relative color syntax, you must put this slash symbol to define what you're going to do for opacity. So now if I hover this, you can see it gives me a 50% opacity. If I make it 25%, you can see it's 25% opacity. And another really great thing about this is I can take a color that is already transparent. So for example, this color I will set to be 50% transparent by default. So by default, you can see it's 50% transparent, and I can actually make it so it's 100% opaque. There's no transparency at all. So now when I hover, it removes my transparency. This is something that's pretty much impossible to do with any other CSS technique because there's really nothing that lets you remove transparency like this, but I can just completely remove it. Or I can even use that alpha channel and I can say, you know what, let's make it slightly more or less transparent. I could say like add 0.2 to that, and now it's going to make it 20% less transparent when I hover over this. Now again, you'll notice it's not quite working, and that's because technically I need to call this alpha instead of just A. So now if I hover, you can see it essentially removes 20% of my opacity every single time I hover. These relative color functions are incredibly amazing because to do this before, you essentially needed to create a bunch of CSS variables like for your hue, for your lightness, for your saturation, and so on, and then you could only modify things in one particular realm of color. While with this from relative coloring, you can essentially convert from one color space to another color space. You can use things that are in RGB, convert them to HSL, and so on. It's really powerful, and I absolutely love it. Now, with all these prerequisites out of the way, we can kind of get to the thing I was actually planning to make this video around, which is the color mix function, which really just lets you combine together a bunch of different colors with different percentages. It's almost like a more powerful and less powerful version of the relative colors because it can do things that relative colors can't, and relative colors can do things that color mixing can't. So again, let's go into our box and we want to say we want to mix together some different colors. So by default, I'll have it be this particular blue color, but I want to mix a color, so I can use the color mix function. And this color mix function first takes in the space you want to mix in. So in our case, let's just do sRGB is the space that we're going to be mixing in. But again, you could do like P3 and so on. There's tons of valid different color spaces that you can use, and it actually works entirely different when you use something like HSL or any other color space that's based on a wheel, a circle of colors, as opposed to something like sRGB, which is a more linear scale. I'll get to how it works with these circular scales in a little bit. We'll focus on linear first because it's quite a bit simpler. The next thing you need to do is you need to define the color that you want to start with. Let's say that our color is going to be red, and then we want to mix in some particular color. Actually, let's start with our normal color. So we'll say color like this. So we're starting with our blue color up here, and we're going to mix in another color, for example, red. If you define your color mix just like this with nothing else, and we give it a save, when we hover, it's going to mix together equal parts of our first color and our second color. So we get half blue, half red in this particular case, which gives us this bluish red color, kind of purplish. The next thing we can do is define how much of a percentage we want each color to contribute. For example, I could say I want to add 20% red only. So I could say just like this. Now what that's going to do is it's going to essentially take my blue color and it's going to add 20% red to it. So it's going to take 80% of my blue color and 20% of my red color, which means it's going to be more blue and less red. And when I hover, you notice this color is much more blue than before. If I wanted to make it more red, I could say maybe 80% red, which defaults this to 20% by default. Now when I hover, you can see it's a much more almost entirely red color that's being created by this. So by default, if you don't leave any percentages at all, it's going to be 50-50 for each. If you add a percentage to one and not the other, it's going to default the other one to whatever the remainder is. So this is 20% blue, 80% red, as you can see. If I give that a quick hover, there we go, it's mostly red. And then finally, if you define two different colors, even if they don't add up to 100%, it's just going to give you the ratio between these two. So in this case, I'm using 40% red, 20% blue, so I'm using twice as much red as I am blue, so we can expect this color to be relatively red. While if I come in here and change this to 80% blue, 40% red, I'm now using twice as much blue as I am red. Again, it's just using the ratio, so now you can see the color is more blue than it is red. So linear colors are relatively easy to add and remove from. And another thing that's really important is you can add in transparency to a color by just adding in the transparent, just like this. So now I'm adding 20% opacity to this particular color. This is a really common thing that you're going to want to do. Also, I'll remove my transparency up here. I really don't need that. So now you can see I'm just adding 20% of transparency because I have 80% of my original color. Now, if we wanted to do more of a hue-based transition, for example, what if we want to do it in the HSL space? Well, this is a hue, and we need to determine how we want to do this based on a wheel, because the way that HSL colors work is 0 is going to be red. If I give that a save, you can see we get red. And 360, which is the maximum value, is also going to be red. So we need to determine how we actually translate from one color to another color, because let's say we have the value of 200, which is where we're going to be at, and we have the value of 0. Are we going to go from 0 to 200 counting up, or are we going to go from 0 to 200 counting down by going to 360 and then counting backwards the other way? We need to determine how we're going to do that translation. So first of all, here we say we want to do this in HSL, and then the next thing we need to specify is how we want to move that translation. So we have a few different values. One of them is going to be a longer hue. So this is going to go whatever is the further distance to get to my particular color. So let's go ahead and add in red here again. So we're going from blue to red essentially. And let's again make sure we convert this color back to blue, which was at 200. So now the way that I'm doing my transition between these colors, and I'll make it even more obvious by changing this to green, which is a 100. So now what I'm doing is I'm going the long direction. So in this case, 0 to 100 is much shorter than 360 to 100. So I'm going from 360 to 100. And if I hover over this color, and I make sure I remove this comma after in HSL, and now I hover over this, you can see I'm getting this really vibrant blue color, which is what's happening when I mix half red, half green. Now, if I go with shorter instead, I'm going to be going the other way on my color wheel. So I'm going between 0 and 100, which should give me exactly 50. And if I hover over this, you now see I get yellow. And actually, if I change this from 100 to 50, you'll notice I get the exact same yellow color that I had before. So it's again, just giving me the dead center between those two because I'm doing 50% in our particular case. Now, shorter and longer is relatively straightforward. The next two values we have are also relatively easy. We have increasing. And increasing is just going to count up from whatever value we're at. So in our case, we're at 100. So we're going to count upwards to 360 to get to red. So we should get that same blue color. Now we have the exact same thing with decreasing. So we can come in here, decreasing. And when I hover, we should get that exact same yellow because I'm counting down from 100 to get to 50. This is something that you only have to worry about when you're using a circular color system. So for example, HSL, where we have a hue that is essentially degrees between 0 to 360. We need to determine which way do we go on that scale to get to the next level we're doing. So this is really nice because it allows you to fine tune exactly how your HSL conversions work to make sure that they're working like you want them to. Now this is a function that's really useful when you want to make minor modifications to a color or maybe add like a tint or a hint of a different color to this, while the relative color is much more useful for when you really want to modify just a single part of a color, for example, the lightness or the alpha value. The next thing and the final thing I want to talk about in this video is going to be having a dynamic light and dark mode directly built into the browser. So what we can do is we can again get rid of pretty much everything that we have here. We can just modify the color we want for this box. And we can have, for example, a color of red on this box. We'll get rid of all this other stuff because none of this actually matters. Now you can imagine a scenario where you want to have this box be one color in light mode and one color in dark mode. For example, we're going to have it be red in light mode, and in dark mode, we'll change it to be a blue box. To do this, you would normally need to deal with like classes where you would have like .box1, .dark mode, or something like that, or you would have like an @prefers color scheme to determine what color scheme the user actually prefers. But instead we have a function that we can use called light dark. And this function just takes in two values. The first value is light mode, the second value is dark mode. Now, if we give it a quick save, you'll notice for me, it's going to be red, and that's because I still have other things to set up and my browser is set to be in light mode by default. But what you want to do is you want to set up your color scheme. And this color scheme should be set to light dark. Essentially what this is going to do is it's going to say use either light or dark mode based on what the browser has specified. Now if I go into my DevTools and I inspect and I click on this little paintbrush icon and I set prefers color scheme to dark, you'll now notice my color scheme has automatically defaulted to dark, and you can see that I get this blue color showing up for my box. And the reason my background also changes to black is because I have my color scheme set right here, so I can toggle between light and dark. If I remove that, you can see that everything essentially stops working. This just allows the browser to use the dark mode colors when you're in dark mode and the light mode colors when you're in light mode. So certain things like buttons will actually be changed inside of this to be a little bit better looking in dark mode, while if I didn't have this, they would be left whatever their light mode counterpart is supposed to look like. So if you have a light mode and a dark mode inside your site, using this light dark function is a really easy way to toggle between multiple different colors without any fancy CSS. Also, you can hard code what color mode you want to be in. So let's just inspect my page and I'll disable all this stuff so it goes back to default. And I can hard code I want to be only in light mode, or I want to only be in dark mode, and it'll actually change the browser to those particular modes. For the most part, I would recommend sticking with just light dark unless you specifically are having a toggle inside of your UI to tell the user this is light mode, this is dark mode. Then you can specifically hard code what color scheme they're in. I think this is really useful for doing light and dark mode, but when it comes to multiple themes more than just light dark mode, obviously this starts to fall apart. Now I know this was a lot to cover, but hopefully you can see how powerful these CSS color functions and color methods can be for defining color systems and doing lots of really impressive stuff with just CSS. And if you want to stay up to date with all the latest CSS content, you're going to want to check out my CSS Simplified course. I just overhauled the entire course to be entirely up to date with the most modern CSS features. So if you're interested in learning CSS, even if you have no CSS experience at all, highly recommend checking out that course. It'll be linked down in the description below. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.